Hello, I'm Jennifer Van Oss from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm happy to be talking to you today about dairy calf housing for positive animal welfare. So I'm going to start by reviewing some of the benefits of social housing for pre-weaned dairy calves according to the scientific literature, and then I'll go over a couple of the common challenges and also solutions for farmers who are using social housing for their calves. And then lastly, I'll close by briefly describing some of the remaining unanswered research questions about calf social housing. So I want to start by talking about a framework for studying animal welfare. And this is adapted from a concept introduced by Dr. David Fraser from the University of British Columbia in Canada that has since evolved to serve as a framework for answering questions about animal welfare, although originally was describing different ways that people might prioritize values around animal welfare. So you can see here there are three overlapping circles, and I'll start with the one at the top, which describes biological functioning. So it's pretty intuitive and obvious why this would matter when we're thinking about an animal's quality of life, and this encompasses the animal's biological fitness, essentially. So things such as health. Is the animal in a state of disease or healthy? Is she injured, or does she have good bodily integrity? And is she productive and reproductive? But when we're talking about welfare, health and biological functioning is critical, but is not necessarily sufficient on its own. And that's because when we're talking about welfare, we're really thinking about the animal's subjective experience, either in a snapshot in time or cumulatively over the course of her life. And what the animal's experiencing can either be positive or negative or somewhere in between. So we call this affective state, that's the scientific term, but it essentially describes the animal's feelings or emotions. And we care about this because animals are sentient and they can experience suffering, or on the flip side, they can experience positive affective states. So, this is why we're not just concerned about biological functioning, because that's an attribute that can also apply to plants or other types of organisms which aren't sentient. So, of course, the animal's biological functioning can influence their affective state. But we're also concerned about this concept that I've labeled natural living. And what that refers to is the animal's ability to express behavioral adaptations. So, thinking about the evolutionary history and also the life stages of a species, what have they adapted to do that if they're unable to express in a captive environment, they could then experience negative affective states? So we want to minimize those negative experiences and promote opportunities for positive ones so that animals can have a good quality of life. One thing I want to point out is that there has been a trend towards talking about positive welfare. So, not just focusing on reducing negative experiences, but also promoting positive ones. And related to the concept of positive welfare is the idea of positive welfare balance. So, this refers to certain types of enriching experiences that can lead to these long lasting effects beyond immediate term positive affective states. So, things that lead to positive welfare balance over the course of an animal's lifetime would manifest in ways where we see improved stress resilience, improved cognitive abilities, as well as flexibility or adaptability to challenges that they experience. So, animal welfare, again, can be talking about a snapshot in time or cumulatively over an animal's lifetime, but this concept of positive welfare balance is really taking this lifetime view. So I wanted to start with this framing because I think social housing for calves is a really good example of a practice that can actually lead to this lifetime positive welfare balance. So, when we're thinking about the natural history of cattle and what we can observe with cattle who are raised in more naturalistic settings, what we can observe is this progression. So, before a cow is about to give birth, she would typically self isolate from the rest of the herd and seek a secluded place for parturition. And then, after the calf is born, they display crushing behavior where the dam would hide the calf from predators and from the rest of the herd and continue to stay isolated. So the dam would graze near the calf, who's hidden, for approximately a week or so. And then that dyad, the cow and calf pair, would rejoin the rest of the herd and interact with other cattle of various ages. And so the calves would be learning socially from same age peers as well as older cattle in their herd. But then we can contrast this naturalistic kind of behavior with what we typically see in industry practice for dairy cattle specifically. So in North America, the status quo standard practice is that calves are separated from their dams within 1 day of when they're born. So that's represented by that red line. And then they would be typically individually housed through the pre-weaning period. So the majority of farms in the US practice individual housing for pre-weaned calves. And then I've noted that they may be transported. So it could be that after calves are born, they're transported somewhere else to be reared during the pre-weaning period. Or this transportation may happen after weaning if they move to a custom heifer growing operation. So that transport may or may not happen depending on the farm. They may raise all their calves and heifer on site, or they may be transported at any point before weaning or after weaning. But typically after weaning is when calves on most farms would be group housed for the first time. And then they continue to be group housed throughout that growing heifer period and also as an adult cow, whether lactating or dry. So why is individual housing the standard practice in North America for pre-weaned calves? And part of that is that the individual calf hutch was developed and considered a major and important innovation. So, what I'm showing here is a page from the history of the Marshfield Agricultural Research Station, which is where here at UW-Madison we actually raise our post-wean heifer calves. So, I was given this book when I started my job that talks about the innovations that came out of the Wisconsin Marshfield Agricultural Research Station. And on this page from the 1960s, I've expanded the text there where you can see it says the calf hutch was developed out of necessity. And that necessity was a crisis in terms of calf morbidity and mortality. And as part of the solution to solving this problem, you can see on this page that scientists and agricultural engineers developed this individual housing for calves, which has since evolved to become the standard practice in North America. So there are several reasons why a lot of farmers use individual housing, and a lot of people in the industry advocate for this. So, one potential advantage is that it allows for controlling the management for individual calves and for monitoring them. So, a farmer can determine how much to feed calves on an individual basis, monitor how much each calf is eating manually, and also potentially monitor for health issues. So, depending on their management style, some producers may favor individual housing for this reason, although others find it easier to monitor for health issues in group housing. Also, thinking back to why the individual hutch was created, there's this idea that physical separation between the animals, essentially a mini quarantine, can reduce some risks for them developing disease. So, if calves are not in full contact, there may be less direct calf to calf contact. There may be less shared aerosol if there's physical separation between them, and there could be less contamination of shared equipment, such as feeding equipment or bedding, transferring between pens or between hutches. I've put an asterisk there though, because oftentimes calves are physically separated, so they don't have full social contact, but they're separated by a fence line. And in that case, calves can have nose to nose contact. They're close enough to have shared aerosol, and there may be bedding transferring between the pens, as well as contamination of shared equipment between those spaces. So, individual housing with fence line contact does not actually prevent this list of concerns. And then lastly, some producers find that with individual housing, this can facilitate the ease of handling calves for routine procedures such as vaccinations or disbudding, for example. So there are historical and practical reasons why many producers like individual housing and why experts in the industry recommend it. But when we look at trends worldwide over the last decade or more, we see that the norm for raising pre-weaned calves may be moving away from individual housing and shifting towards some kind of full social contact, whether this is pair housing, group housing, or some form of cow-calf contact. So what I'm showing here is a screenshot. It's just an example headline from 2018 that says Tesco reveals reason for single calf hutch ban. So Tesco is a grocery retail chain in the UK, and they represent over a quarter of the market in the UK. And that headline is a little bit misleading because it says hutch ban, but it's not about the individual outdoor hutch. It was about individual housing. And so since that time, there has been a shift in the UK. So you can see one survey showed that in 2010, about 40% of UK farms were using social housing for pre-weaned calves. And then over a decade later in 2021, that percentage had flipped. So 62% of farms in the UK were using social housing for pre-weaned calves. So in the screenshot I took, I circled where on the sidebar it says research shows benefits of pair housing calves pre-weaning. And that's part of what I want to talk about today is why was this decision made? Does the research actually back up that pair housing could be superior to individual housing? So it isn't just across the pond that we're seeing these trends. In Canada as well, the recently updated Canadian Code of Practice now has a requirement that effective in 2031, pre-weaned dairy calves must be housed in pairs or groups by the time they're 4 weeks old. So there is no equivalent requirement in the US, but now there's this precedence where we're seeing trends either driven by the market or through regulations that we're seeing patterns that calves are starting to be pair housed or group housed. And so this is something that I think is important to have the conversation about and think about here in the US. So, what exactly do we even mean by social housing? So, when I say social housing or pair or group housing, I'm referring to rearing calves with full social contact with at least one same age peer. So, I'm showing some snapshots here of different types of pair or group calf housing you might see in a barn environment. And this isn't completely representative. There are, of course, many different variations. So, on the upper left, we have a calf barn here in Wisconsin with a large group pen with automatic milk feeders and positive pressure ventilation system. And then below that, we also have another farm here in Wisconsin, but here they have smaller groups with manual feeding. So they use these milk bar mob feeders where calves have one large communal bucket, but then individual teats that they use to consume their milk. And then on the right, I have some examples of group calf housing in Australia, where they raise their adult cows in a grazing or pasture system, but their calves are group housed. And so you can see on the top, they also have individual nipple buckets with feeding stalls. So there's a space for each calf in that group housing situation. And then underneath that, there are buckets, but with hoses connected to nipples. So again, at least one bucket per calf in that pen. And one thing all of these different scenarios have in common is that they are feeding milk through a nipple. And we'll come back to that later. There are also ways to rear calves in pairs or groups in outdoor settings. So, for example, on the upper left here is a photo that a former graduate student of mine took in Texas, where they adapted their existing outdoor individual hutches to become pair housing by attaching a modified fence around the outdoor area. And in that case, they're bottle feeding. And you can see below that a prefabricated super hutch that is intended to pair or group house calves that traditionally we've seen more for post-wean calves, but that can also be adapted to pair or group housing for pre-weaned calves. And then on the upper right, we have a similar system to the one from Texas, but in this case, the outdoor area is a bit smaller, but this adapting of the existing hutches can also be used in different climate regions. And then on the bottom, we have an example that was shared with me of a custom design that the farmers made in Arizona, where they raise Jersey calves and they have entirely wire mesh surrounding them to allow for airflow and then a roof over those pens to provide shade. So there are a lot of different ways farmers can provide social housing, either by purchasing prefabricated housing, adapting pens inside of a barn, or by adapting existing outdoor hutches in an outdoor setting. So I also just want to mention that I'm going to be giving sort of a surface level overview of a lot of the research and some of these practical considerations, but we have created this free series that's available on my website that talks through what are the benefits of pair housing and then what are some of the considerations for farmers if they want to attempt pair or group housing, some of the common challenges, different ways that people can implement this successfully. So, to talk about the benefits of social housing, I think the first reason that it can be beneficial is because it fits within the natural history of the species and also the life stage. So, going back to what we discussed earlier with how cattle would behave in a naturalistic setting, they are a herd species, and that is how they evolved. But in addition to that, studies have shown that calves are motivated for full social contact and it's something that they prefer. So, I want to talk through what I mean by motivation and how that's tested, just briefly. So, in animal welfare research, we often use a technique called motivation testing, and this can allow us to infer how much something is worth to an animal or how important it is. So, we do this by asking animals to pay a price to access a resource or to perform a behavior. And this has been used across various species, not just cattle. So, depending on the species, we could ask them to push increasingly heavy weights, and this has been done with cattle, or we can ask them to press a button or a lever repeatedly and increase the amount of times they have to pay that price to access a resource. And this has been done with calves as well as with rodents and other species. Or we can ask animals to navigate some kind of obstacle, so to create a challenge that way to see what they'd be willing to do. So the idea is if a behavior or a resource is important to the animal and they value it, they will be motivated to gain access to that resource or perform that behavior. And we can test this by seeing that they're willing to work harder as the price increases to continue to gain access to that resource or the opportunity to perform that behavior. So through this kind of test, we've been able to see studies demonstrate that calves are motivated for social contact with their peers. There have been other studies getting at calf welfare when they're housed in pairs or groups in the pre-weaning period by looking at what's called a judgment bias test. And what researchers have inferred from these is that calves that are socially housed from a young age show possible evidence of having more positive emotional states and therefore good welfare. So, the way these tests work, again, these have been done on many different species, including with cattle, is that individual animals are trained to associate different stimuli as either positive or negative. So, with the positive stimuli, they learn to associate that when they see that, they are going to get some kind of reward. So, in the case of calves, that would be some milk. And when they see this stimulus that is associated with something negative, then they get some kind of punishment. So they learn to discriminate between the positive stimulus and the negative stimulus. So this could be, for example, a red screen or a white screen. And then they're presented with ambiguous cues. So this could be based on color or location or other types of cues. And the test is, do they respond as if they're expecting the reward, like they would have when they saw the positive stimulus, or do they respond as if they're expecting the punishment, like when they see the negative stimulus? So if they respond as if they anticipate a reward, the inference is that they have an optimistic outlook reflecting a positive affective state. And if they react as if they're expecting a punishment, this is a pessimistic outlook reflecting a negative affective state. So these kinds of tests have demonstrated that calves raised in these social contexts tend to show more of these optimistic test responses, suggesting that they're in this positive affective state or demonstrating good welfare. But that's not the end of it. There's other further evidence that social housing can be beneficial for calf welfare. So, another set of benefits is what I like to call calves learning to play with each other, both literally and figuratively. So, in the literal sense, when calves are socially housed, and that's often combined with a greater total space allowance, as long as space per calf is at least maintained, then what we see is an increase in the expression of play behavior, which is also sometimes considered an indicator of positive welfare. But calves also learn to play with others figuratively because this enhances their social development. So, just like in a naturalistic setting, they're learning to interact with others of their kind and to communicate appropriately within their species. A further benefit that has been observed across several studies when calves are raised socially from a young age is all of these things that I outlined earlier under this concept of positive welfare balance. So, there's evidence that calves raised in pairs or groups from an early age show greater resilience to stress, particularly during weaning. So, weaning is always a stressful period in the calf's life when they're weaning down from milk. But calves who have been reared in pairs or groups from an early age show dampened responses, so fewer vocalizations, a lower cortisol response, and they also show greater cognitive or behavioral flexibility. So, again, this is equipping them with their ability to navigate challenges throughout their lives. And related to that, they've been shown to be more adaptable to new things, and this includes new feed types. So, I'm not going to go through how all of these studies determine this, although this has been replicated, but I want to just briefly touch upon the practical implications. So, I think that this cognitive ability and this flexibility does matter when we're thinking about the lifetime of our typical dairy cow, because through her lifespan, she is expected to encounter a lot of new situations and challenges and to be able to learn and adapt to those changing circumstances. So, picturing a pre weaned calf moving through her life to growing heifer housing and then to lactating and dry cow housing, she will encounter many new housing elements. So, for example, a calf may have been housed in an outdoor hutch and then post weaning moves to a bedded pack and then later on moves to free stalls. And in each of those different housing environments, she needs to recognize what's an appropriate place to lie down. What is the place to get food and water? How does she recognize what is a food source? And we are constantly changing their diets. And these studies have shown that these calves raised in pairs or groups are more willing to try new feed items sooner. In these situations, they may also be regrouped and have to adapt to these new social groups. So, again, when they're housed with their peers from an early age, this helps with their social development. And then, lastly, for lactating cows, part of their job on the farm is to produce milk, or rather, their primary job. And oftentimes, cows need to adapt to milking in a parlor, maybe a double parlor, maybe a rotary, or to an automatic milking system. So there's learning involved in those situations. And that's why it's important that they be adaptable and behaviorally flexible and be able to face new challenges. So, related to their ability to adapt to new feeds, there has also been many studies that have demonstrated benefits for their biological functioning. So, not just their affective states or their social development, their cognitive development, but also these physically observable, tangible benefits for the calf's physical development, which then can also benefit the farm as a business when we have calves that grow better. So, many studies have documented greater solid feed intake, so of calf starter. And also, this is often accompanied by greater weight gains or average daily gain. So this is the table that I've created that adapts from a review paper by Dr. Joao Costa, although I've also updated it with many of the studies that have come out since then, although more studies keep coming out every year. And the take home message here is that no study to date has ever shown that individually housed calves outperform calves raised in pairs or small groups during the pre weaning period in terms of starter intake or growth. So, what this represents is the symbols show whether pair or group housed calves had statistically greater intakes or growth. The gray equal signs represent whether these studies did not detect a difference between individually housed or socially housed calves. And the red minus signs would represent where pair or group housed calves had significantly lower intakes or growth. So what you can see is that no study has ever found that the pair or group housed calves had lower intakes or lower growth. Many studies did not detect a statistical difference, But many studies actually have detected that pair or group house calves had greater intake or greater growth. So this is something that has been shown time and again, although not all studies detect a difference. But when I talk to producers, what I want them to see from this is that it doesn't seem to hurt when we're talking about calf growth. So they may not detect a benefit, or they might find a difference. And many producers have done their own mini experiments where they start pair housing or group housing some calves. They're able to measure differences in intake or growth, and then they end up shifting their entire calf raising system over to pair group housing. When we look beyond the pre-weaning or immediate post-weaning period, there's some more recent evidence that these performance advantages might actually persist as the heifers continue to grow. So, one study has found that these previously pair or group house calves had greater body weight at 12 months old. And then another couple of studies have found that another study that we did found that these differences persist even when they're about 18 to 20 months old. So again, no studies have found a disadvantage for early life pair housing compared to individual housing when it comes to calf growth. Another study has also recently, it's actually still a recent study has come out that's shown that there is a difference in total first lactation milk yield, although this was primarily driven by the previously pair house calves having a greater probability of being retained in the herd, although this was just a tendency. So more long-term work is needed to see how early life pair housing translates into later life productivity. So, one last benefit that's not directly to the calves themselves, but perhaps for the long term social sustainability of dairy farms or dairy farming, is the effect of pair or group housing on consumer perception or public perception. So, one study done by the University of Minnesota found evidence that pair or group housing had greater public acceptance compared to individual housing. Although I do want to note that this wasn't replicated in another study that used a different experimental design and was focusing more on a different research question about calf and cow contact. So in the Minnesota study, they showed participants these three photos in a randomized order. So it was a within subjects design, and they asked people to specify whether they approved of this way of raising calves, whether they disapproved, or they were either neutral or had no opinion. So for individual housing, you can see only a third of participants approved, but nearly half of people disapproved. Whereas with pair housing, 2/3 of people approved, and with group housing, 3/4 of people approved, and a much smaller percentage of these participants disapproved of social rearing. So I think this is an area where we could benefit from more research to understand public perception of these practices, because this could suggest that group housing is not only good for the calves' development, both physical and social, as well as cognitive, but could also help with this long-term social sustainability of dairy farming. So I want to start to transition to talking about some of the practical considerations for social housing of calves. And first, I want to address a common question, which is, would it be considered social housing if the calves have fence line contact rather than full contact? And my answer is no. I would still consider that individual housing. So they do have limited contact, but not really full social contact. So I wouldn't consider that pair housing or group housing. And for several reasons, I think that that's really not a long-term compromise or long-term solution. So the first is that the studies I mentioned earlier have found that calves are more motivated for true full social contact than fence line contact. And also, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of fence line contact doesn't have the supposed benefits that true individual housing would in terms of preventing direct calf to calf transmission of disease and preventing also contamination of shared airspace or shared resources. And then lastly, when we're thinking about public perception, sometimes we just really need to keep it simple. And there's not a way that we're going to persuade your average person on the street that fence line contact means that the calves are not housed individually. They're still going to see that as separation. And there's some evidence that this was the case with chicken housing. And so we can assume that the same principles might hold when it comes to cattle housing. So, the first potential challenge I want to address is about calf health and group housing. So, thinking back to the historical reasons why individual housing is the norm in our industry, it is mainly around concerns about maintaining good calf health. But there hasn't been as much research directly on calf health and group housing, and part of that is just challenges around obtaining sufficient sample sizes. So when we're just looking at pairs or small group housing, so pairs or triples, there have been a handful of studies that have looked at calf health outcomes, and the findings are equivocal. So basically, in these handful of studies, most of them don't find detectable differences in calf health, but when comparing individual housing or pairs and triples. One study has found an advantage actually of pair group housing compared to individual housing, and then one study found the opposite. So I think what this shows is that there aren't consistent health disadvantages to pair or group housing, but more research is needed. When we're talking about larger groups, though, I think that's where caution is needed. So, this is adapted from a review by Dr. Terry Olivet. And what she concluded, again, is that much more research is needed. There haven't been a whole lot of studies done specifically on this topic. And she was really focusing on respiratory outcomes. And in this case, you can see that there aren't any studies showing an advantage of group housing compared to individual housing. There's a small number of studies finding disadvantages and a small number of studies not detecting any difference. And so she also concluded more research is needed and that larger group sizes appear to be a risk factor. So it's not one size fits all. Some farms can succeed in raising healthy calves in larger groups, but perhaps pairs or triples, these smaller groups, are a good compromise for producers who want to try out social housing rather than jumping into large groups unless they're very confident they can manage those large groups well. What I want to emphasize here, though, is that calf health is not just based on group size, whether this is individual, pairs, triples, or larger groups. There are a lot of these other factors that influence calf health. And this is where we've learned so much over the last few decades, where even though the calf hutch was this important innovation in the 1960s, we have other more recent innovations available to us. So we don't need to just isolate calves from each other in order to ensure good health. So if we have good preventive care and monitoring programs, good colostrum management, good nutrition, especially the liquid nutrition for pre-weaned calves, good hygiene practices, sanitation, biosecurity, ventilation is a big one where we've learned a lot, and then also ensuring adequate space allowance, clean, dry bedding, and then when managing calves in groups or in a barn, ensuring that we use all in, all out moves rather than trickling in and trickling out. If we can get all these ducks in a row, many farms are successfully raising healthy calves in these group settings. One thing to mention here is we discussed group size. So when thinking about the optimal group size, not every farm can sustain larger groups. And that's because there are these health risks, but also because we want to keep the age range as narrow as possible. So when we're selecting the group size, we want to minimize both disease and competition for food, and that achievable age range on a farm is going to depend on their calving rate. So if more calves are born in a shorter period of time, then the farm could potentially consider larger groups with these other caveats in mind. The greater the gap, the greater the potential for competition, and also the greater this potential for older calves transmitting disease to the younger ones. So, when we've talked to various experts, we've found this recommendation that there should be no greater than a 2 week age gap between the oldest and youngest calf in a pair or group. And ideally, that age difference should be much narrower. So, when we surveyed bovine veterinarians, we found that 80% suggested that farmers have no greater than a 1 week age difference between the oldest and youngest calf in a group. We also asked veterinarians at what age should these pairs or groups be formed? Should it be at birth? Should they wait until the calves are older? And so here I'm showing you the distribution. And so if you add up those bottom three bars, what we found is that 2/3 of the vets in our survey said they would prefer that clients pair calves actually when they're 2 weeks old or less. And this was younger than we expected. Just based on some anecdotes in talking to people, we thought that vets might prefer pairing calves when they're older, 3 weeks or 4 weeks, but actually most of the veterinarians in our survey preferred to pair calves younger. And so we don't have time today to talk about it, but there is some limited evidence that pairing earlier may have greater welfare benefits. I do quickly want to address what I think is actually the most common challenge that farmers ask me about, perhaps because my training is in animal behavior, or perhaps because we have fewer solutions available to address this problem. And that's cross sucking. So we had conducted a survey of farmers and we asked them to tell us how often they believe that they see cross sucking. So this is not quantitative. We didn't go out and corroborate this with our own measurements, but we asked about their perceptions. So, out of the producers who currently use paragroup housing, 85% said they see at least occasional cross sucking. But then, interestingly, we also asked producers who use individual housing with fence line contact how often they think they see cross sucking. And at least 70% of them also said they see at least occasional cross sucking, although it could be on different parts of the body since those calves could not have full social contact. It's something I get a lot of questions about from farmers, whether they currently individually house and are afraid to consider pair housing because they're worried about this problem, or farmers that are currently pair or group housing. But in terms of the research, there isn't a lot that's looked at the long term implications of cross sucking. So, one study looked at cross sucking behavior in pre wean groups and naval infections during that life stage, and they didn't find an association. Another looked at long term cross sucking that persisted after weaning, and they followed these into their first lactation, and they did not find an association between that long term cross sucking behavior and mastitis or somatic cell count. But then one other study did find greater odds of udder health issues in the first lactation after those cattle were previously pair housed pre weaning, but they didn't quantify cross sucking behavior. So it's not really clear what is happening and driving that. So this is something where we need more research, but it's something that we need to take seriously because it's something that producers are worried about, and we want to minimize the occurrence of this behavior because it is an abnormal oral behavior. So the good news is that pre-weaning, there's a lot of research on how to minimize cross-sucking behavior. And the two key ingredients are the amount of milk fed and the method by which it's delivered. So the first key is to reduce hunger, not through the solid feeding program for these very young calves at that stage of life. They're really relying on their milk, and so we need to make sure that we're feeding a fairly generous volume of milk. So in quarts, this would be at least 8 to 10 quarts or even more. And that would be equivalent to about 15% of body weight for Holsteins or even higher. And this should be accompanied by some form of step down weaning. So not abrupt, which is increasingly rare anyway. And in an ideal world, this would be based on starter intake to ensure that they're not experiencing hunger, although there can be practical challenges with that in a pair or group setting. And the second thing, in addition to feeding enough milk, is to feed the milk through a method that allows calves to suckle appropriately, because cross sucking is just the abnormal manifestation of an instinctive natural behavior. So there have been many studies looking at this, including by our group. And so that's what I'm showing a picture of is one of our studies where we looked at different milk feeding methods and also different starter feeding methods. So when we compared conventional open bucket feeding to using these slow flow milk bar teat buckets, we found that the teat buckets dramatically reduce the amount of cross sucking. That's what I'm showing on the left. On the right is another follow-up experiment we did where we also use the milk bar system, but with individual 4-quart bottles. So the milk feeding method, I think, is the most important, but there are other ways to provide calves opportunity to suckle. So this could just be with blank nipples to serve as a pacifier. But what we investigated was using these Braden bottles, which allow grain to pass through and give the calves early exposure to starter. So we also found that the Braden bottles reduce cross-sucking behavior, although not to the same extent as feeding milk through some kind of nipple. I think many farmers have found this through trial and error. So, when we did this survey of producers, we found that the vast majority of those using individual calf housing were feeding through open buckets or some kind of nipple-less system, whereas those using pair or group housing were predominantly feeding calves through a nipple. Because if you are going to use social housing, if you don't feed through a nipple, you're going to have a bad time for this reason. So, my overall takeaways is that social housing of calves has been demonstrated in the research literature to result in numerous different types of benefits for the calves. And I think that this can lead to this concept of positive welfare balance and these long term upsides that help calves face challenges throughout their lives. There can also be practical challenges that producers face when implementing social housing, but there are also a lot of strategies to try to address them, particularly for health issues. And that these are not insurmountable. There's many farms out there doing this successfully, and it's not one size fits all, but we have these blueprints to follow for success. I want to again link to the resource that we've written, and we are trying to keep this updated as more research is constantly coming out. And what I want to end with is just a brief wish list of where I think that there are still knowledge gaps where we need more research to help us answer some of these remaining questions. So I've taken my diagram about this conventional progression through these life stages for a typical dairy calf, which becomes a dairy cow. And I've added there this blue silhouette representing calves not housed individually, but rather in pairs or groups. So one thing that we still don't know about that my group is looking at is how does this social housing during the pre-wean period affect the calves' gut development and microbiome development. So we're actually currently doing a study to try to do this comparison since this hasn't been investigated. And we're looking at additional indicators about stress around weaning, as well as stress around transportation. So this is an area where calf transportation has become this hot topic of research, but nobody has compared how calves who are raised individually or in social groups respond to this type of stressor. And based on how they respond to other stressors, we would hypothesize they may be more resilient to transport stress. We also need more research on cross sucking that either appears or persists after weaning, because even though we have a lot of tools to address it during the milk feeding period, we know a lot less about why cross sucking happens after weaning and what we can do about it. And so that is something that my lab is also trying to work on, is following these calves post weaning and trying to associate cross sucking with udder and mammary gland development as well as injury, and trying to understand the impact of cross sucking behavior. I think we also need more research on long-term performance. It can be really challenging to conduct these longitudinal studies and to follow them into their first lactation and beyond. So we need more research to try to replicate these initial findings that have started to come out and understand, in particular, how cross-sucking does or doesn't affect long-term udder health and productivity. And then circling back all the way to the beginning of the calf's life, this is kind of the elephant in the room where globally cow calf contact systems have become this hot research topic. And there is some research here going on in North America, but what we consider long term contact is a lot shorter than what's being investigated in Europe. And so, even though this is a growing research topic, I think more research would really be beneficial. I personally don't feel that it's practical right now to recommend prolonged cow calf contact for our North American dairy industry, but I think it's important that we try to answer these questions so that we can have productive conversations with dairy producers and calf raisers. So, with that, I'm really looking forward to taking questions. If there's any follow up questions people have or suggestions, observations you've had in the field working with dairy farmers, I always love to hear from people, and that helps drive my research and extension program. Thank you.